There is a particular kind of American story that begins not with luck but with belief. Belief that the right idea, applied with enough discipline and enough will, could be turned into something that outlasted the man who built it. Harvey Samuel Firestone believed this completely. He believed it the way a builder believes in the permanence of stone, not as a hope but as a working assumption. And for the better part of a century, the empire he constructed from rubber and ambition seemed to prove him right. Firestone was born in 1868 in Columbiana County, Ohio, into a world still largely organized around horses and harvests. There was nothing in his early surroundings that pointed inevitably toward industrial greatness, no inherited fortune, no family connections to the great Eastern banking houses. What he possessed instead was a particular clarity of mind, a capacity to look at a market, identify its pressure points, and position himself precisely where growth was about to happen. He sold buggies before he sold tires. He understood distribution before he understood manufacturing. By the time he arrived in Akron, Ohio in 1900 with 12 employees and a leased building on South Main Street, he had already spent years studying how commerce moved and what made it accelerate. The timing was not accidental. The automobile was no longer a curiosity. It was becoming a machine with a future, and that future required tires, reliable, affordable, mass-produced tires that could keep pace with the ambitions of men like Henry Ford. Firestone saw this connection early and pursued it with a directness that left little room for sentiment. He approached Ford directly, negotiated a supply contract, and in doing so attached his company's trajectory to the most powerful industrial force of the coming century. It was a decision that compressed decades of potential growth into years of actual growth, turning a small Akron operation into a name that would eventually circle the globe. What followed was not simply expansion. It was the construction of a system. Firestone believed that the companies which endured were not those that produced the best product in a single moment, but those that built the most coherent and defensible structure over time. He integrated vertically before vertical integration had a name, acquiring rubber plantations in Liberia, controlling his own raw material supply, reducing his dependence on markets he could not predict. He built his own steel rim factories. He developed his own research divisions. He created a company that, at its fullest expression, could trace a finished tire back through every stage of its existence to the soil from which its rubber had been drawn. By the 1920s, the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company was one of the most recognizable industrial names in the United States. The Akron complex had grown into a city within a city, miles of factory floor, tens of thousands of workers, a physical presence so vast that it seemed less like a building and more like a geographic feature. Firestone's friendship with Ford and Thomas Edison was not incidental to this success. It was part of the same logic that governed everything he did: align with strength, build relationships that multiply your reach, and never confuse fame with permanence. He was not a flamboyant man. He did not build mansions designed to signal his wealth to passing strangers. What he built instead was a family. 5 sons, raised with the explicit understanding that what their father had constructed was not merely a business, but a stewardship. The Firestone name was not a brand to be managed. It was a responsibility to be carried. Harvey Sr. made this clear not through sentiment but through structure. His sons were educated in the company's operations from the ground up. They were expected to understand not just the boardroom but the factory floor, not just the balance sheet but the rubber that made it possible. When Harvey Firestone Sr. died in 1938, he left behind an empire that had survived the First World War, navigated the Great Depression, and positioned itself for dominance in the age of the automobile. He left behind a name that was synonymous with American industrial confidence. And he left behind 5 sons who had been told, in every way a father could tell his children, that what they held in their hands was irreplaceable. What none of them could have known, what none of them were perhaps equipped to understand, was how much the world would change, and how much those changes would demand of the men who inherited the Firestone name. That story begins with the sons. Inheritance is rarely as simple as it appears from the outside. What looks like privilege is often pressure, the particular weight of a name that arrived before you did, that carries expectations you did not choose and obligations you cannot easily refuse. The Firestone sons understood this in their bones. They had grown up inside the empire, watched their father build it with a discipline that bordered on devotion, and absorbed the unspoken message that their primary duty in life was to prove themselves worthy of what he had made. Harvey Firestone Jr. assumed leadership of the company after his father's death in 1938, stepping into a role he had been groomed for and yet could never fully inhabit on his own terms. He was intelligent, capable, and deeply loyal to the company's founding principles. He maintained the operational structures his father had built, preserved the family's controlling interest, and guided Firestone through the enormous industrial demands of the Second World War, a period that required the company to pivot rapidly toward wartime production, supplying the Allied forces with tires, rubber products, and military equipment at a scale that tested every system Firestone possessed. Harvey Jr. passed that test. Under his leadership, Firestone emerged from the war years not diminished but enlarged. Its manufacturing capacity expanded and its reputation as a reliable industrial partner firmly established. The post-war boom carried the company further still. America was building highways and buying automobiles at a pace that seemed to have no ceiling, and Firestone was positioned at the center of that movement, supplying the tires that put the country in motion, sponsoring the Indianapolis 500 with a consistency that made the Firestone name inseparable from American speed and ambition. But Harvey Jr. was operating inside a structure his father had designed for a specific era, and the discipline required to maintain that structure was different from the discipline required to build it. Building demands vision, maintaining demands vigilance. Harvey Sr. had possessed both in abundance. His son possessed the vigilance but operated in a world that was beginning to require something neither quality fully addressed: adaptability. The capacity not merely to run a great system, but to recognize when that system needed to be reinvented. The second generation did not fail dramatically. It succeeded steadily, and that steady success may have been its most significant vulnerability. Companies that perform well within inherited frameworks rarely feel the urgency to question those frameworks. The numbers continue to justify the structure. The structure continued to produce the numbers, and beneath that reassuring cycle, the world outside was beginning to change in ways that Firestone's internal logic was not designed to detect. When control passed to the third generation, to Harvey Firestone Sr.'s grandsons, the gap between the company's self-image and its actual competitive position began to widen. These were men who had inherited not just a company, but a mythology. The Firestone name carried such institutional weight, such deeply embedded associations with American industrial supremacy, that it functioned almost as a shield against uncomfortable questions. Why interrogate a legacy that had produced such consistent results? Why disrupt systems that had proven themselves across decades? This is the quiet trap of great dynasties. The founder builds with hunger because he has nothing yet. The first heirs maintain with pride because they remember the hunger. But by the third generation, the hunger is a story told at dinner tables, and pride has softened into assumption, the assumption that what was built will continue to stand, not because anyone is actively defending it, but because it has always stood. The Firestone grandsons were not careless men. They were products of their inheritance, educated, polished, and genuinely committed to the company's continuation. But commitment to continuation is not the same as capacity for transformation. And the decade approaching them carried within it a crisis that would demand exactly that. Not stewardship, but reinvention. Not the careful maintenance of a proven system, but the willingness to question everything the system had been built upon. They were not ready for what was coming. Very few heirs ever are. To understand what was eventually lost, you must first understand what existed at the peak, not as an abstraction, not as a collection of financial figures or market share percentages, but as a living, breathing industrial presence that touched the lives of hundreds of thousands of people across multiple continents and defined in very concrete terms what American industrial power looked like when it was operating without restraint or apology. At its height, the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company was not simply a manufacturer. It was an ecosystem. The Akron complex alone covered more than a square mile of factory floor, employing tens of thousands of workers whose entire economic existence, whose mortgages, whose children's educations, whose retirements, was organized around the rhythm of the Firestone production schedule. The factories ran continuously, day and night, their output feeding a domestic automobile market that was consuming tires at a rate the previous century could not have imagined. Akron was the rubber capital of the world, and Firestone was its largest and most powerful resident. But the empire extended far beyond Ohio. Harvey Firestone Sr. had understood early that dependence on external rubber suppliers was a structural vulnerability, and he had moved decisively to eliminate it. In 1926, he established the Firestone Plantation Company in Liberia, leasing 1 million acres of land in a deal that gave the company direct control over its most essential raw material. The Liberian operation became one of the largest rubber plantations on Earth, a vast agricultural enterprise that supplied Firestone's factories with a steady, controllable flow of natural rubber, insulating the company from the price volatility that plagued competitors who purchased on the open market. The plantation was controversial from the moment of its creation, drawing criticism for its labor practices and its relationship with the Liberian government. But within Firestone's internal logic, it represented the purest expression of the founder's philosophy: eliminate variables, control inputs, build a system so self-contained that external disruption becomes manageable. The plantation was not a humanitarian project. It was an industrial one, conceived and operated according to the same principles that governed the Akron factories. Efficiency first, scale always. Beyond Liberia, Firestone operated manufacturing facilities across the United States and internationally, with plants in Canada, Europe, and Latin America serving regional markets with locally produced products. The company's distribution network was equally vast, reaching dealers and retailers across every American state and dozens of foreign countries. By mid-century, Firestone products were present on virtually every road in the developed world, carried there by a logistics operation of extraordinary reach and coordination. The Indianapolis 500 became the company's most visible cultural expression. Firestone's association with the race began in 1911 and deepened over the following decades into something that transcended ordinary sponsorship. The Indy 500 was speed, danger, and American ambition distilled into a single afternoon, and Firestone was woven into its fabric so completely that the two became mutually defining. When a driver won at Indianapolis on Firestone tires, the victory belonged to the brand as much as to the man behind the wheel. The racing connection was not merely marketing. It was identity, a statement that Firestone tires operated at the extreme edge of performance, where failure was not an option and excellence was the only acceptable standard. The company's revenues reflected this dominance. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, Firestone consistently ranked among the largest industrial corporations in the United States, generating hundreds of millions of dollars annually and returning substantial profits to the family that controlled it. The Firestone name appeared not just on tires but on gas stations, retail stores, and service centers, a vertically integrated consumer presence that made the brand a fixture of daily American life in a way that few industrial companies ever achieved. What made this peak remarkable was not just its scale but its apparent solidity. Firestone did not feel like a company riding a wave. It felt like a company that had become the wave itself, so deeply embedded in the structure of American mobility, so thoroughly integrated into the supply chains and consumer habits of a car-dependent nation, that its continuation seemed less like a business outcome and more like a natural law. This is the illusion that great industrial empires construct around themselves, and the most dangerous aspect of that illusion is how completely it is believed, not just by outsiders but by the families who built it. The Firestones believed it completely, and for a long time the world gave them every reason to. There is a particular kind of corporate disaster that arrives not as a single catastrophic event, but as the slow accumulation of decisions made inside a system that has stopped questioning itself. The Firestone 500 tire crisis of the late 1970s was both things simultaneously: a sudden, public, devastating rupture and the inevitable product of choices that had been building quietly inside the company for years. It was the moment the illusion cracked, and once cracked, it could never be entirely restored. The Firestone 500 was a steel-belted radial tire, introduced in the early 1970s as Firestone's answer to the growing consumer demand for radial technology. The shift toward radials was already underway globally, driven largely by European manufacturers, Michelin in particular, who had spent years perfecting a design that offered superior durability, fuel efficiency, and handling compared to the bias-ply tires that had dominated the American market for decades. Firestone recognized the threat and responded with the 500, positioning it as the company's flagship radial product and marketing it aggressively to a public that was increasingly aware of what radial technology promised. The problem was that the Firestone 500 did not deliver what radial technology promised. It delivered something considerably more dangerous. Reports began emerging in the mid-1970s of tread separation, the outer layer of the tire peeling away from its body at highway speeds, causing drivers to lose control with sudden and catastrophic consequences. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration began receiving complaints in growing numbers. Investigations were opened. The evidence accumulated with a persistence that Firestone's internal communications would later suggest the company had been aware of and had chosen, at various levels of the organization, not to address with the urgency the situation demanded. By 1978, the crisis could no longer be contained. Congressional hearings were convened, and the testimony that emerged painted a picture of an industrial giant that had prioritized production schedules and market positioning over the safety of the people using its products. Internal documents suggested that quality control failures had been identified and minimized rather than corrected. The language used inside the company to describe the tire's problems stood in stark and damning contrast to the language used in its advertising. The recall that followed was one of the largest in American automotive history. Approximately 14 deaths were attributed to failures of the Firestone 500, though advocacy groups argued the true figure was considerably higher. More than 41 million tires were eventually recalled, a number so large it strained comprehension, representing not just a product failure but a systemic failure of the processes and priorities that had allowed a defective tire to reach tens of millions of American vehicles. The financial cost was staggering. Firestone absorbed losses estimated at $147 million directly related to the recall, a figure that in the late 1970s represented a genuinely existential pressure on the company's balance sheet. Plants were closed. Thousands of workers were laid off. The workforce, which had once numbered over 100,000 people globally, began a contraction that would continue for years. But the financial damage, severe as it was, may have been less consequential than the reputational damage. The Firestone name had been built on a single foundational promise: that its products performed reliably under pressure, that when your life depended on the rubber between your vehicle and the road, Firestone was the name you could trust without reservation. The 500 crisis did not merely challenge that promise, it inverted it. For millions of American consumers, Firestone became associated not with reliability, but with its opposite, with a company that had known its product was dangerous and had allowed that danger to persist. The heirs who presided over this crisis were not villains in any simple sense. They were executives managing a vast and complex organization under competitive pressures that were intensifying from every direction. The radial transition had been expensive and technically demanding. The company had moved too quickly, cut corners it should not have cut, and then found itself trapped between the cost of admission and the cost of concealment. These are failures of judgment and institutional culture, not of malice. But they were failures nonetheless. And they occurred on the watch of men who had inherited from Harvey Firestone Sr. not just a company but a set of standards. Standards that the founder had treated as non-negotiable precisely because he understood that a brand built on trust is destroyed not by competition but by betrayal of the people who trusted it. Harvey Sr., had built Firestone on the premise that reliability was not a marketing claim but an engineering commitment. His grandsons had allowed that commitment to erode under the pressures of a market they were struggling to navigate. The cracks were visible now. The question that would define the following decade was not whether Firestone could repair them. It was whether the men who held the company's future in their hands had the capacity to try. There is a phrase that appears, in various forms, in the histories of nearly every great industrial dynasty that failed to survive its third generation. The phrase is deceptively simple. They lost the thread. Not the money, not the factories, not the market position. Those things eroded later as consequences. What they lost first was something more fundamental and harder to name, the invisible line connecting the company's daily decisions to the founding logic that had made those decisions coherent. The sense embedded in every choice of what the company was ultimately for and what it was never allowed to become. Harvey Firestone Sr. had never lost that thread. It ran through everything he did, through his supply chain decisions and his pricing strategies, and his relationships with Ford and Edison, and his insistence that his sons learn the business from the bottom upward. The thread was not sentimentality, it was clarity, a precise and unsentimental understanding of what the company's strength was built upon and what would happen if that foundation was compromised. By the early 1980s, the Firestone heirs had lost it. The decade that followed the 500 recall was one of sustained institutional drift, a period in which the company made a series of decisions that individually appeared rational and collectively amounted to a slow surrender of competitive relevance. Plant closures continued as the company attempted to reduce its cost structure in response to the financial damage of the recall years. Modernization investments were made selectively rather than comprehensively, reflecting a leadership that understood the need for change but flinched from its full cost. The result was a company that was neither fully committed to its legacy infrastructure nor fully transitioned to the newer systems that the evolving tire market demanded. The global tire industry was undergoing a structural transformation that rewarded exactly the qualities the Firestone heirs were struggling to demonstrate. Michelin had completed its conquest of the radial market and was expanding aggressively into the United States. Bridgestone, the Japanese manufacturer founded in 1931, was growing with a speed and strategic discipline that recalled nothing so much as the early Firestone of Harvey Sr.'s era. Focused, integrated, and utterly clear about where it was going. Goodyear, Firestone's oldest domestic rival, was investing heavily in modernization and international expansion. The competitive landscape was consolidating around companies that had made decisive commitments to the future, and Firestone was positioned uncomfortably between its past and a future it had not yet fully chosen. The boardroom dynamics of this period reflected the same ambivalence. Family control, which had once been a source of the company's coherence and long-term thinking, had become a source of its paralysis. The decisions required in the 1980s demanded a willingness to accept short-term pain of a severity that family shareholders, many of whom depended on Firestone dividends for their personal financial stability, were psychologically and practically resistant to absorbing. Transformation at the scale the company needed would have required the kind of unsentimental restructuring that founders undertake because they have no legacy to protect, only a future to build. The heirs had a legacy, and the weight of it made radical action feel like betrayal rather than survival. This is not a story unique to Firestone. It is the recurring tragedy of family industrial empires in the second half of the 20th century, the collision between the long-time horizons that family ownership theoretically enables and the psychological difficulty of accepting losses that feel personal rather than merely financial. Selling a plant that your grandfather built is not the same as selling an underperforming asset. Abandoning a product line that your father championed is not the same as executing a portfolio rationalization. The emotional texture of these decisions is different, and that difference matters more than most business histories acknowledge. Through the mid-1980s, Firestone continued to operate, continued to produce tires, continued to maintain its position as one of the largest tire manufacturers in the world. But the momentum was no longer self-generating. The company was being sustained by its existing scale rather than propelled by a coherent vision of where it was going. Revenue was under pressure. Market share was eroding. The financial performance that had once made the Firestone name synonymous with industrial success was becoming increasingly difficult to defend. The thread was gone, and without it, the company was no longer navigating. It was drifting toward a transaction that would resolve, in a single afternoon in 1988, everything the heirs had been unable to resolve across an entire decade of trying. Bridgestone did not arrive at Firestone's door by accident. It arrived by design, the product of a strategic calculation so methodical and so patiently executed that it bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the way Harvey Firestone Sr. himself had once approached markets he intended to dominate. The irony was not lost on those who understood both companies' histories. The same philosophy of integration, scale, and long-term positioning that had built the Firestone empire was now being deployed with considerable precision to acquire it. Bridgestone had been founded in 1931 in Kurume, Japan, by Shojiro Ishibashi, a man whose name translated into English meant literally stone bridge, a fact he found significant enough to reverse into his company's name. From its origins as a domestic Japanese tire manufacturer, Bridgestone had grown steadily through the post-war decades into one of Asia's most formidable industrial companies, building its reputation on the same qualities that had defined Firestone at its best: engineering rigor, manufacturing consistency, and a commitment to quality that made its products trusted across demanding markets. By the 1980s, Bridgestone had identified international expansion as the central imperative of its next phase of growth. The Japanese domestic market, while substantial, was not large enough to support the global ambitions the company had developed. The United States represented the largest tire market in the world, and penetrating it meaningfully required more than export relationships and distribution agreements. It required physical presence, factories, brand recognition, and the kind of deep market integration that could only be achieved through acquisition rather than organic growth. Bridgestone had made an earlier move in this direction in 1983, acquiring a Firestone plant in Liberia, Tennessee, a transaction that gave the Japanese company its first American manufacturing foothold and, more importantly, its first direct insight into Firestone's operational strengths and vulnerabilities. That acquisition was a reconnaissance mission as much as a business transaction, providing Bridgestone's leadership with an intimate understanding of what a full Firestone acquisition would involve and what it would be worth. What it would be worth, Bridgestone concluded, was a great deal. Despite its struggles, Firestone remained a company of extraordinary underlying assets, a globally recognized brand, an extensive manufacturing network, established relationships with every major American automobile manufacturer, and a distribution infrastructure that had taken decades to construct and could not be replicated quickly at any price. The 500 recall had damaged the brand's consumer reputation, but it had not destroyed the industrial relationships that formed the true foundation of Firestone's value. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler still relied on Firestone as a primary supplier. Those relationships in the tire industry were the closest thing to guaranteed revenue that existed. The negotiations that followed were not straightforward. Firestone's board was not unanimous in its enthusiasm for a sale, and the process was complicated dramatically by the emergence of a competing bid from Pirelli, the Italian tire manufacturer, which recognized the same underlying value that Bridgestone had identified and moved aggressively to capture it. The bidding contest that developed between Bridgestone and Pirelli briefly gave the Firestone board the leverage of competition, driving the price upward and forcing both suitors to reveal the true ceiling of their ambitions. Bridgestone did not blink. Its leadership had committed to the acquisition with a conviction that reflected not just financial calculation, but strategic necessity. Losing Firestone to Pirelli would have set Bridgestone's American expansion back by years, perhaps decades. The company bid with the determination of an organization that understood precisely what was at stake and had decided that the price, whatever it ultimately reached, was worth paying. For the Firestone board, the decision was framed as a resolution, a way to provide the company with the capital, the technological resources, and the strategic direction that family ownership had proven unable to supply. The language used in boardroom discussions emphasized partnership, investment, and the preservation of the Firestone brand. These were not entirely dishonest framings. Bridgestone did intend to invest. It did intend to preserve the brand. But beneath the careful language of corporate diplomacy, something simpler was happening. America's greatest tire dynasty was being sold, and the men selling it were the grandsons of the man who had built it. On May 4, 1988, the Bridgestone Corporation of Japan announced the acquisition of the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company for approximately $2.6 billion. It was, at the time, the largest Japanese acquisition of an American company ever completed, a transaction so significant in its scale and its symbolism that it arrived not merely as business news but as a cultural event, touching something raw and unresolved in the American understanding of its own industrial identity. The number itself was striking. $2.6 billion represented a premium of roughly 40% above Firestone's market value at the time of the offer, a signal of how desperately Bridgestone wanted the company and how clearly its leadership understood what the Firestone name, the Firestone factories, and the Firestone supplier relationships were genuinely worth beneath the damage of the preceding decade. Pirelli had pushed the price upward, but Bridgestone had absorbed every increase without hesitation, demonstrating a financial commitment that left no ambiguity about its intentions. The American reaction was immediate and complicated. In the business press, the acquisition was analyzed with the cool vocabulary of corporate finance: synergies, market access, brand value, integration costs. The numbers were examined, the strategic logic was assessed, and the conclusion reached by most financial commentators was that Bridgestone had paid a full price for a valuable asset, and that the transaction made sense on its own terms. This was, after all, the late 1980s, a period of intense Japanese corporate expansion into American markets that had already included high-profile acquisitions in real estate, entertainment, and electronics. Firestone was the latest chapter in a story that American business had been reading with increasing unease for several years. But outside the business press, the reaction carried a different emotional register. Firestone was not a semiconductor company or a recording studio. It was rubber and steel and highway and speed. It was the Indianapolis 500 and the American automobile and the long straight roads of a country that had defined its 20th century identity partly through the freedom of movement that companies like Firestone had made possible. The sale felt, to many Americans who had no direct connection to the tire industry, like the transfer of something that should not have been transferable. Not just a company, but a piece of the country's industrial self-image. For the workers inside Firestone's factories, the reaction was more grounded and more anxious. Abstract questions of national identity mattered less than concrete questions of employment: whether the new Japanese owners would honor existing labor agreements, whether plants would remain open or be consolidated, whether decades of accumulated seniority and pension entitlements would survive the transition. Bridgestone moved carefully on these questions in the immediate aftermath of the acquisition, offering reassurances and maintaining operational continuity in ways designed to minimize disruption. But reassurance and continuity are not the same as permanence, and the workforce understood the difference. The Firestone family's role in the transaction was perhaps the most quietly devastating element of the story. The family had not been forced to sell. There had been no hostile takeover, no activist shareholder revolt, no regulatory intervention that had stripped control from the heirs and placed it in foreign hands. The Firestones had chosen this outcome, had evaluated their options, assessed their circumstances, and concluded that selling to Bridgestone represented the most responsible path available to them. By any dispassionate measure, that conclusion was defensible. The company needed capital and strategic direction that the family had demonstrated it could not provide from within. The Bridgestone offer was generous. The alternative, continuing to drift in an increasingly competitive global market without the resources to compete effectively, carried its own risks and its own costs. And yet the choice remains. In the history of American industrial dynasties, one of the most poignant surrenders ever voluntarily executed. Harvey Firestone Sr. had spent his life building something he believed his family would carry forward indefinitely. He had groomed his sons for stewardship, structured the company around family control, and created an institution whose identity was so thoroughly bound up with the Firestone name that separating one from the other seemed almost conceptually impossible. His grandsons had separated them in an afternoon. The transaction closed, the papers were signed, and the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company passed from the hands of the family that had built it into the ownership of a Japanese corporation that had spent the better part of a decade positioning itself to acquire it. America's greatest tire dynasty was now a Japanese asset. The name would survive. Everything else was negotiable. Acquisitions are judged, ultimately, not by the price paid or the strategic logic articulated at the moment of signing, but by what the acquiring company does with what it has purchased in the years that follow. By that measure, Bridgestone's stewardship of Firestone presents a story of genuine complexity, one that contains real investment and real improvement alongside a second crisis so damaging that it raised uncomfortable questions about whether the fundamental problems that had weakened the company under family ownership had truly been resolved or merely deferred. In the immediate years following the 1988 acquisition, Bridgestone invested heavily in Firestone's American operations. Factories were modernized. Manufacturing processes were upgraded with Japanese production techniques that emphasized precision, consistency, and waste reduction, the same principles that had made Bridgestone's own facilities among the most efficient in the global tire industry. Capital that the Firestone family had been unable or unwilling to deploy was committed with a decisiveness that reflected Bridgestone's confidence in the underlying asset it had acquired. The Firestone brand was maintained as a distinct consumer identity, operating alongside Bridgestone's own nameplate in a dual-brand strategy that preserved the American name's market recognition while integrating it into a genuinely global industrial system. For a period, this appeared to be working. Firestone's manufacturing performance improved. Its supplier relationships with the major American automakers were maintained and in some cases strengthened. The operational drift that had characterized the final years of family ownership gave way to the kind of focused, disciplined management that Bridgestone's corporate culture prioritized. The acquisition began to look, from the outside, like a successful rescue, a great American brand stabilized and reinvigorated by the injection of foreign capital and management discipline. Then came the Ford Explorer. In the late 1990s, reports began emerging of catastrophic tire failures on Ford Explorer SUVs, equipped with Firestone Wilderness AT tires. The failures followed a pattern disturbingly familiar to anyone with knowledge of the 1978 recall: tread separation at highway speeds, sudden loss of vehicle control, accidents with fatal consequences. By 2000, the crisis had become impossible to contain. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration opened a formal investigation. Ford and Firestone, whose relationship stretched back to the founding partnership between Harvey Firestone Sr. and Henry Ford, found themselves on opposite sides of a public catastrophe, each pointing toward the other as the primary source of the problem. The recall that followed covered approximately 14.4 million tires, larger in number than the 1978 recall, and arriving with the amplifying force of a 24-hour news cycle and the Internet's capacity to organize and accelerate public outrage. The death toll attributed to Explorer rollovers connected to tire failures reached into the hundreds. Congressional hearings were convened. Firestone's chief executive testified before lawmakers in scenes that recalled, with painful precision, the congressional appearances of 2 decades earlier. The company that Bridgestone had acquired partly to rescue from reputational damage had generated, under Japanese ownership, a reputational crisis of comparable or greater severity. The parallels between 1978 and 2000 were not coincidental. They pointed toward something structural, a persistent gap between the Firestone brand's public commitments and the quality control realities inside its manufacturing operations. Whether that gap originated in the family era and survived the transition to Bridgestone ownership, or whether it was created anew under the pressures of post-acquisition integration, remains a question that the available evidence does not resolve cleanly. What the evidence does establish is that the acquisition had not by itself repaired the institutional vulnerabilities that had made the 500 crisis possible. Bridgestone survived the Ford Explorer crisis, absorbing enormous financial and reputational costs and implementing reforms that its leadership insisted would permanently resolve the quality issues at the root of both recalls. The Firestone brand survived as well, continuing to operate as a significant presence in the American tire market under Bridgestone's ownership. Retail locations bearing the Firestone name remained visible on American streets, servicing vehicles and selling tires to consumers who may or may not have been aware of the full history attached to the name above the door. The name had endured. But endurance and integrity are not the same thing, and the distance between what the Firestone name had once meant and what it meant now was a measure of everything that had been lost. First gradually, then suddenly, then gradually again. Cities do not grieve the way people do. They do not hold funerals or observe moments of silence or gather in public squares to acknowledge what has been lost. They absorb loss instead, slowly, unevenly, in the particular language of vacancy and reduced circumstance that marks the places where industrial empires once stood and no longer do. Akron absorbed the loss of Firestone the way it had absorbed everything the rubber industry had given and taken across a century, quietly, practically, and at considerable human cost. The contraction had begun before the sale. The plant closures and workforce reductions of the late 1970s and 1980s had already begun the process of dismantling the employment structure that Firestone had spent decades constructing across the city. But the 1988 acquisition accelerated and deepened that process in ways that the reassurances of the transition period had not fully anticipated. Bridgestone rationalized its newly acquired manufacturing network with the efficiency its corporate culture demanded, consolidating production, closing redundant facilities, and redirecting output toward plants whose cost structures and technological capabilities aligned with its global standards. Akron, whose factories had been built for an earlier industrial era, did not fare well in that calculus. The jobs that disappeared were not abstract units of economic output. They were the organizing principle of entire lives, the reason families had settled in particular neighborhoods, the assumption around which mortgages had been taken and children had been raised and retirements had been planned. When those jobs contracted and then largely vanished, the consequences radiated outward through the city's social fabric with a thoroughness that no retraining program or economic development initiative could fully address. The problem was not simply that people needed new work. It was that the entire structure of daily life that industrial employment had created, the rhythms, the relationships, the sense of shared purpose that comes from working alongside the same people toward the same ends for decades, had no ready replacement. Neighborhoods that had housed generations of Firestone workers began to show the particular signs of industrial abandonment that became familiar across the American Midwest in these decades. Housing values declined as demand contracted. Vacant properties accumulated, their deterioration accelerating once the maintenance that occupancy demands was no longer applied. Commercial districts that had thrived on the spending power of industrial wages contracted alongside them. The diners and hardware stores and clothing shops that had served a working population, finding themselves without the customers that had justified their existence. The physical infrastructure of the city told the same story in concrete and steel. The vast factory complexes that had once defined Akron's skyline and identity did not disappear overnight. They stood increasingly silent, their scale now serving as an architectural record of what had been rather than a functional expression of what was. Some buildings were repurposed over time, converted into warehouses, commercial spaces, or the kind of mixed-use developments that urban planners offered as evidence of adaptation. Others were demolished, their sites cleared for possibilities that did not always materialize with the speed or scale that had been projected. What replaced the rubber industry in Akron's economic life was real but different in kind: healthcare, education, logistics, and the polymer research sector that grew partly from the scientific legacy of the rubber industry itself. The University of Akron developed a nationally recognized program in polymer science, drawing on the city's industrial heritage to build an academic identity that attracted research funding and generated employment of a different character than the factory floor had provided. These developments represented genuine resilience, evidence that a city could reconstitute itself around new sources of purpose after the loss of the industry that had originally defined it. But resilience is not restoration. The Akron that emerged from the decades following Firestone's sale and contraction was a smaller city, a quieter city, a city whose relationship with its own history was complicated by the knowledge that the greatness it had once embodied had been built on a foundation that proved less permanent than anyone had believed. The workers who had given their working lives to Firestone had not made the decision to sell. They had not sat in the boardroom in 1988 and weighed the offers from Bridgestone and Pirelli. They had simply arrived for their shifts, done what the company asked of them, and trusted that the name above the factory gate would honor the implicit contract that employment represents. That contract had been broken. Not by them. History does not render verdicts. It accumulates evidence, arranges it in sequence, and leaves the conclusions to whoever is paying attention. The story of the Firestone dynasty, from Harvey Sr.'s leased building on South Main Street in 1900 to the boardroom transaction of 1988 that transferred his life's work to foreign ownership, does not resolve into a simple moral. It resolves into something more useful and more uncomfortable than that. It resolves into a mirror, reflecting back the particular vulnerabilities that great American industrial families have always carried within the structures of their greatness. Harvey Firestone Sr. built something genuinely remarkable. This is not a sentimental observation, but a factual one. In the space of 4 decades, he transformed a small Akron operation into a global industrial empire that employed hundreds of thousands of people, supplied the automobile industry that defined 20th-century American life, and created a brand so deeply embedded in the culture of American mobility that it became, for a time, nearly synonymous with the roads it served. The scale of that achievement deserved acknowledgement on its own terms, separate from what came after. What came after is a story about inheritance, about the specific difficulties that arise when the qualities required to build something great are not automatically transmitted to the people who receive it. Harvey Sr. possessed a founder's clarity, the unsentimental, forward-facing conviction of a man who has nothing yet and must create everything. That clarity cannot be taught directly. It can be modeled, encouraged, and structurally supported, but it cannot be inherited the way a factory or a balance sheet can be inherited. The Firestone sons and grandsons received the empire. They did not receive the hunger that had made the empire possible. This is not a condemnation. It is an observation about the nature of institutional succession that applies far beyond the Firestone family. The founder builds with urgency because the alternative is failure. The heirs maintain with care because the alternative is loss. But maintenance and building are different disciplines, and the 20th century tire industry, transformed by radial technology, globalization, and intensifying international competition, demanded building long after the family had shifted into maintenance mode. The gap between what the moment required and what the heirs were equipped to provide was not a gap of character. It was a gap of circumstance, of timing, of the particular misfortune of inheriting a great institution at precisely the moment when greatness required reinvention rather than stewardship. The Firestone name survives today as a brand, visible on retail service centers and passenger tires across the American market, carried forward under Bridgestone's ownership with a consistency that preserves its commercial utility while holding its historical weight at a careful distance. The name functions in its current form as a trademark rather than a legacy, a recognizable identifier attached to products and services that bear little relationship to the industrial empire that gave it meaning. This is not unusual. It is, in fact, the standard fate of great American brand names that outlive the families and the eras that created them. What cannot be preserved by trademark is the thing that made the name worth preserving in the first place. The particular combination of ambition, discipline, and industrial confidence that Harvey Firestone Sr. embodied, and that the company at its peak expressed in steel and rubber and the unbroken rhythm of factory production. That combination belonged to a specific moment in American history, a moment when it was still possible to believe that a man with the right idea and sufficient will could build something permanent, something that would carry his name and his values forward indefinitely, generation after generation, immune to the erosions of time and competition and change. The Firestones believed that. For a while the world confirmed it, then the world changed, as it always does, and the belief was tested against realities it had not been designed to survive. What the Firestones left behind is not a failure. It is a record of what American industrial ambition looked like at its fullest expression, of what the passage of that ambition from one generation to the next costs, and of what remains when the empire is gone and only the name survives. The name survives. It always does. The question history asks is whether the name still means anything.